It's 1962, and two of Hollywood's biggest stars are locked in a brutal fight scene that would go down in cinema history. But this wasn't just acting. Gregory Peck, the gentleman of Hollywood, the man who embodied integrity and grace in every role he played, actually threw a real punch that connected with Robert Mitchum's jaw. The cameras kept rolling. Mitchum took the hit like the tough guy he was, and nobody watching in theaters that year had any idea that what they were seeing was genuine animosity bubbling to the surface. This is the untold story of the man Gregory Peck truly hated more than anyone else in Hollywood. And trust me, by the time we're done here, you're going to see this legendary actor in a completely different light. Now, before we dive into the explosive details of this Hollywood feud, let me set something straight. Gregory Peck wasn't known for making enemies. This was a man who represented everything noble about the golden age of cinema. When you think of Gregory Peck, you think of Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, that moral compass of a character who stood for justice and righteousness. You think of the dignified sea captain in Moby Dick, or the principal reporter in Roman Holiday, who fell for Audrey Hepburn's princess. This was a man who carried himself with such class that even President Richard Nixon, who wasn't exactly known for his love of Hollywood liberals, begrudgingly put Peck on his famous enemies list. That's right, Peck was so outspoken about his political beliefs, so dedicated to civil rights and opposition to the Vietnam War, that he became a political enemy of the most powerful man in the world. But we're not here to talk about Nixon today. We're here to talk about something far more personal, far more visceral, and far more revealing about the real Gregory Peck behind that polished Hollywood facade. The story really begins long before that fateful punch during Cape Fear. To understand why Gregory Peck truly hated Robert Mitchum more than anyone, we need to understand who these two men were at their core. Gregory Peck was born Eldred Gregory Peck in 1916, and he hated that first name so much that he never used it. Can you blame him? Eldred sounds like somebody's great-grandfather who sits on the porch complaining about kids these days. His mother had insisted on the name because she thought it was distinct and sophisticated, but young Gregory couldn't get rid of it fast enough. This tells you something about Peck right from the start. He was a man who cared deeply about how he was perceived, about crafting an image that matched his internal sense of dignity and worth. He studied acting at the neighborhood Playhouse School of Theater in New York, learning his craft the traditional way, studying voice, movement, and the classics. He believed in preparation, in understanding your character inside and out before you ever stepped in front of camera. This was a man who did his homework, who showed up on set knowing every line, every motivation, every beat of the scene. He was professional to a fault, and he expected everyone around him to approach their work with the same level of dedication and respect. Robert Mitchum, on the other hand, couldn't have been more different if he tried. Born in 1917, just a year after Peck, Mitchum came from a rougher background. His father was killed in a railroad accident when Robert was just 2 years old, and young Mitchum spent his teenage years riding the rails like a genuine Depression-era drifter. He was arrested for vagrancy, worked odd jobs, got into fights, and lived the kind of hard-scrabble existence that Hollywood publicists would later spin into marketing gold. Where Peck studied acting in prestigious schools, Mitchum basically fell into the business almost by accident. He brought a naturalistic, almost lazy quality to performances that audiences found magnetic. He had this ability to seem like he wasn't even trying, like he just rolled out of bed, wandered onto set, and happened to deliver one of the most memorable performances you'd ever see. He was the anti-actor, the guy who made it look easy, who famously said that acting was just the oldest form of prostitution, and that all you had to do was learn your lines and show up. This cavalier attitude, this seeming disrespect for craft that Peck held so sacred, was like fingernails on a chalkboard to Gregory Peck. But their differences went deeper than just their approach to acting. These two men represented fundamentally different philosophies about what it meant to be a star in Hollywood. Peck believed in using his platform for good, for speaking out about important issues, for setting an example both on and off screen. He was heavily involved in political causes, served as president of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1969 for his humanitarian work. He took his responsibility as a public figure seriously, understanding that with great fame came great power and great obligation. Mitchum, by contrast, seemed to take nothing seriously. He was arrested for marijuana possession in 1948, a scandal that would have destroyed most careers at that time. But Mitchum rode it out with a shrug and came back bigger than ever. He openly mocked Hollywood pretension, told reporters exactly what he thought even when it got him in trouble, and generally acted like someone who couldn't care less about maintaining a carefully cultivated image. Where Peck was controlled and dignified, Mitchum was loose and unpredictable. Where Peck gave thoughtful interviews about the important themes in his films, Mitchum would show up half in the bag and crack jokes about how stupid the whole business was. Now, you might be thinking, these guys are just different personalities. Why would that lead to genuine hatred? Well, that's where the story gets interesting. Their paths had crossed before Cape Fear. They'd been in the same Hollywood circles for years, attending the same parties, working with the same directors, competing for the same roles. But it was during production of Cape Fear in 1961 and 1962 that everything came to a head. Here's the setup. Cape Fear was a psychological thriller directed by J. Lee Thompson, based on a novel called The Executioners by John D. MacDonald. Gregory Peck played Sam Bowden, a successful attorney living a picture-perfect life with his wife and daughter in a small southern town. Robert Mitchum played Max Cady, a violent ex-convict who blames Bowden for his prison sentence and comes back to terrorize Bowden's family. It's a tense, masterfully crafted thriller that holds up incredibly well even today. But here's where things get complicated, and this is a detail that really reveals the depth of Peck's feelings about Mitchum. Gregory Peck wasn't just starring in Cape Fear. He was also producing it through his production company, Melville Productions. That meant Peck had specifically chosen Robert Mitchum for the role of Max Cady. He had given Mitchum the part, negotiated his contract, and paid him what Peck himself later described as a terrific amount of money. And here's the kicker. Peck knew, even as he was hiring Mitchum, that Mitchum's role was a juicier part. So what went wrong? According to Peck's own words years later, the problem was that Mitchum seemed to think he had acted Peck off the screen. After the film was released to critical and commercial success, Mitchum apparently started taking credit for the film's impact, suggesting in interviews and private conversations that a performance had elevated what would have otherwise been a forgettable thriller. And this, more than anything else, is what drove Gregory Peck absolutely crazy. Here was Peck, who had given Mitchum the role, who had paid him handsomely, who had understood from the beginning that Mitchum would have the flashier part, and instead of gratitude or even basic professional courtesy, Mitchum was essentially saying, "Yeah, I carried that movie. You're welcome, Greg." In Peck's mind, this wasn't just ungracious. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of how collaborative filmmaking worked, how actors should support each other, how you should conduct yourself as a professional. Peck later said, and this is a direct quote, "I had given the role and had paid him a terrific amount of money. It was obvious he had the better role. I thought he would understand that. But he apparently thought he acted me off the screen. I didn't think highly of him for that." Now, let's break down what that quote really means, because there's a lot of suppressed anger in those carefully chosen words. "I had given him the role" suggests ownership, generosity, a gift bestowed from one professional to another. "I thought he would understand that" implies an expectation of gratitude, of recognition for the opportunity provided. And that final line, "I didn't think highly of him for that," is about as close as someone like Gregory Peck, with his carefully maintained public image of gentlemanly behavior, would ever come to saying, "I hated that guy's guts." This wasn't just a professional disagreement. This was personal. This was about respect, about loyalty, about understanding your place in the Hollywood hierarchy. And from Peck's perspective, Mitchum had violated all of those unspoken rules. But there's another layer to this story that makes it even more fascinating. The physical production of Cape Fear was genuinely dangerous and intense. This wasn't a film where actors showed up, said their lines, and went home to their trailers. The climactic fight scene, the one where Peck's punch connected with Mitchum's face, was shot on a houseboat on the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. The conditions were difficult. The choreography was complex, and both actors were doing their own stunts. There's a scene where Sam Bowden and Max Cady fight in the water, and according to multiple accounts from the set, Mitchum actually almost drowned Peck during the filming. The scene called for Katie to push Bowden's head underwater, and Mitchum, always the method actor even though he claimed to hate method acting, held Peck under for longer than the director had specified. Peck had to genuinely struggle to get his head above water, and when he finally surfaced, gasping for air, there was real fear and anger in his eyes. The cameras captured it all, and it made for an incredibly intense moment in the final film. But on set, in that moment, Peck wasn't acting. He was legitimately fighting for his life, and Mitchum had put him in that position. Now, you could argue that this was just two professional actors pushing each other to create great cinema. And in some ways, that's true. The final product is phenomenal. Their fight scene is one of the most brutal and realistic combat sequences of that era. But context matters. This wasn't a case of two actors who trusted each other so much that they could push boundaries together. This was a case of Robert Mitchum, who already had a reputation for being difficult and unpredictable, taking things too far with an actor who valued control and safety above all else. And then, adding insult to nearly literal injury, that same actor went around afterward suggesting that his reckless approach to the role had made the film better than it would have been with someone more careful in the part. The punch that Peck landed on Mitchum later in that same sequence was an accident in the traditional sense. Yes, technically it was a mistake. Peck was supposed to throw a stage punch that would look real on camera but not make contact. But multiple people who were on set that day have suggested that maybe, just maybe, there was a part of Gregory Peck that wanted that punch to land. After being nearly drowned, after dealing with Mitchum's cavalier attitude throughout the production, after watching Mitchum show up late or unprepared or half-drunk to set, perhaps there was a moment where Peck's legendary control slipped just enough for his fist to connect with Mitchum's jaw. Mitchum needed stitches afterward. The story goes that Mitchum took like a champ, laughed it off, said something like, "I felt it for days," in his typical laconic fashion. But that only made things worse from Peck's perspective. Here was Mitchum, turning even his own pain into a badge of honor. Another example of how tough and real and authentic he was compared to all these other Hollywood phonies who pulled their punches and played it safe. The animosity between Peck and Mitchum during Cape Fear became something of an open secret in Hollywood. Crew members talked about the tension on set. Other actors noticed how Peck and Mitchum barely spoke to each other between takes. The director, J. Lee Thompson, reportedly spent a lot of time playing mediator, trying to keep his two stars focused on the work rather than their personal issues. And this is where the story reveals something important about the nature of film production in that era. Today, if two major stars hated each other on set, social media would be full of leaked videos and anonymous sources spilling tea to entertainment websites within hours. Back then, Hollywood was much better at keeping its secrets. The studio system, even though it was declining by the early 1960s, still had enough power to control the narrative. Reporters who wanted access to stars and premieres knew better than to write about on-set conflicts. And actors themselves, even someone as outspoken as Mitchum could be, generally understood that openly bad-mouthing your co-stars was bad for business. So the public never knew. When Cape Fear was released in 1962, audiences saw two phenomenal actors at the top of their game, creating electric chemistry on screen. They had no idea that the intensity they were watching came from a place of genuine dislike rather than acting technique. Critics raved about the performances. Bosley Crowther of the New York Times called it a tense and engrossing thriller and praised both Peck and Mitchum's work. The film was a commercial success, earning back several times its modest budget and becoming one of the most talked about thrillers of that year. From the outside, it looked like a perfect collaboration. Only the people who were there, who saw the daily reality of that production, knew the truth. What makes this story particularly interesting is how it contrasts with Gregory Peck's other professional relationships. This was a man who remained close friends with many of his co-stars for decades. He and Audrey Hepburn, his co-star in Roman Holiday, maintained a warm friendship for the rest of his life. In fact, there's a beautiful story about how Peck insisted that Hepburn receive equal billing for Roman Holiday, even though she was a relative newcomer and he was already a major star. He recognized her talent and her contribution to the film, and he used his power to make sure she was properly credited and compensated. That's the Gregory Peck that most people knew, the generous professional who lifted up his colleagues. He was famously close with Ava Gardner, who co-starred with him in several films. They became such good friends that when Gardner died in 1990, Peck took in her housekeeper and even her dog because he wanted to honor her memory by taking care of the people and animals she had loved. That's not the action of a difficult or selfish person. That's someone with genuine compassion and loyalty. So what was it about Robert Mitchum specifically that brought out this darker side of Gregory Peck? Part of it, undoubtedly, was the clash of personalities we've already discussed. But there's something more, something that gets at the heart of what acting meant to each of them. For Gregory Peck, acting was a noble profession, a calling, an art form that demanded respect and dedication. He had studied at prestigious institutions, worked his way up through theater, paid his dues. He believed that being an actor meant being a craftsman, constantly improving your skills, treating each role as a serious undertaking. When he played Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird, he didn't just show up and say the lines. He researched lawyers, studied the book extensively, worked with director Robert Mulligan to understand every nuance of the character. He wanted to do justice to Harper Lee's creation, to honor the themes of racial justice and moral courage that the story represented. That's how Gregory Peck approached his work, every single time. Robert Mitchum, on the other hand, represented everything that Peck probably feared about the direction Hollywood was heading. Mitchum was a prototype for a new kind of movie star, one who succeeded on charisma and presence rather than technique and training. He was self-taught, instinctive, raw. He didn't need acting school. He didn't need to study. He just walked onto set and was exactly what the camera wanted. And the infuriating thing for someone like Peck was that Mitchum's approach worked. Audiences loved him. Directors loved working with him, despite his reputation for being difficult. His performances in films like The Night of the Hunter, Out of the Past, and yes, Cape Fear, are considered some of the best of that era. He achieved greatness through what looked like indifference, and that probably drove Gregory Peck crazy, because it undermined everything Peck believed about what it took to be a great actor. There's also an element of jealousy here that's worth acknowledging. Not jealousy of Mitchum's talent exactly, but jealousy of his freedom. Gregory Peck had constructed this perfect image for himself. The dignified leading man, the moral voice of Hollywood, the actor of integrity. But maintaining that image was exhausting. It meant always being on, always being controlled, always thinking about how every action and word would be perceived. Peck couldn't just roll into a bar and get drunk and tell outrageous stories like Mitchum could. He couldn't shrug off a bad review or a professional disappointment with Mitchum's famous "so what" attitude. Peck cared too much, felt too responsible for his reputation and his legacy. And here was Mitchum, who seemingly didn't care about any of that, and yet was just as successful, just as respected in his own way, just as much a movie star. That had to rankle. The aftermath of Cape Fear is telling. Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum never worked together again. In a career that spanned 5 more decades for both of them, they never found another project where their paths crossed professionally. That's not an accident. In Hollywood, especially during that era, actors who would work well together were often reteamed by studios and producers who knew their chemistry would sell tickets. Think of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, who made 9 films together, or Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, or later, Robert De Niro and Martin Scorsese. When something works, Hollywood tends to repeat it. The fact that nobody ever tried to reunite Peck and Mitchum suggests that the word was out in the industry that these two didn't get along, and the hassle of managing their animosity wasn't worth whatever box office boost their reunion might generate. There's a fascinating coda to this story that brings it full circle. In 1991, director Martin Scorsese directed a remake of Cape Fear, starring Robert De Niro as Max Cady and Nick Nolte as Sam Bowden. The film was a critical and commercial success, introducing the story to a new generation. Scorsese, being the film historian that he is, wanted to honor the original film, so he cast Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum in small supporting roles. Peck played a corrupt lawyer who betrays his client, and Mitchum played a sympathetic police lieutenant. It was a nice bit of metacasting, having the original stars appear in a remake, but in different types of roles than they played originally. But here's the thing, Peck and Mitchum don't appear in any scenes together. Not one. Despite being the same film, Their characters never interact, never share screen time, never even appear to be in the same location. Some people have suggested this was just how the script worked out, that there was no narrative reason for their characters to meet. But other people on that production have hinted that it was a very deliberate choice, that Scorsese and his producers knew about the history between Peck and Mitchum and made sure to schedule their shoots separately to avoid any potential conflict. By 1991, both men were in their 70s. Peck was 75, Mitchum was 74. They had long since moved into the elder statesman phase of their careers. You would think that decades of distance from Cape Fear might have mellowed whatever hard feelings existed between them, but apparently not. The fact that they couldn't or wouldn't appear in the same scenes suggests that the animosity ran deep and never fully healed. And that's particularly striking when you consider that this was near the end of both their careers. Mitchum would pass away in 1997, Peck in 2003. They had so little time left, and yet they still couldn't put aside their differences even for a small cameo in someone else's film. What's interesting is how each man talked about the other in interviews over the years. Mitchum, true to form, would usually deflect with humor when asked about Peck. He'd tell stories about the accidents on set, make jokes about Peck being too serious, but he never really engaged with the substance of their conflict. It was all surface level, all for entertainment value. He'd say things like, Greg was a good actor, very professional. Took everything seriously, maybe too seriously, and leave it at that. It was classic Mitchum, using his wit and charm to avoid any real emotional vulnerability or honest discussion of his relationships. Peck, on the other hand, was more direct when he chose to discuss it, though he rarely brought it up unless specifically asked. That quote we mentioned earlier about giving Mitchum a role and not thinking highly of him for how he acted afterward comes from an interview Peck gave later in life. He had clearly been sitting on those feelings for years, waiting for the right moment to express them. And even then, even when he was being critical, he couched it in relatively diplomatic language. He didn't say, I hated working with that arrogant jerk. He said, I didn't think highly of him for that. For someone like Gregory Peck, that level of public criticism was basically the equivalent of declaring eternal enmity. He was telling the world, in the most polite way possible, that Robert Mitchum had violated his trust and professional standards, and he had never forgiven him for it. This brings us to an important question. Was Gregory Peck right to feel the way he did? Was his hatred of Robert Mitchum justified? Or was it an overreaction based on incompatible personalities and conflicting work styles? The answer probably depends on your own values and what you think professional relationships should look like. If you believe that gratitude and loyalty are paramount, that when someone gives you an opportunity, you should acknowledge it with grace and humility, then Peck's position makes sense. He had been generous to Mitchum, and Mitchum had responded with what Peck perceived as arrogance and ingratitude. That's a betrayal of professional ethics from that perspective. But if you believe that once you're paid for a job, you don't owe anyone anything beyond the work itself, that artistic contributions should be evaluated independently of off-screen relationships, then maybe Mitchum did nothing wrong. He took a role. He gave a great performance. And if that performance happened to be the most memorable part of the film, well, that's just the reality of the work they created together. Acknowledging that publicly isn't arrogance. It's honesty. The truth, as it usually is, probably lies somewhere in the middle. Both men had legitimate perspectives based on their different approaches to the business and the craft. Peck wasn't wrong to feel hurt when Mitchum seemed to dismiss his contribution to Cape Fear and to their professional relationship. But Mitchum also wasn't necessarily wrong to take pride in a performance that people still talk about more than 60 years later. The problem was that neither man had the tools or the inclination to bridge that gap, to have an honest conversation about their expectations and feelings before it all turned into deep-seated resentment. There's something almost tragic about this story when you step back and look at it. Here were two of the greatest actors of their generation, two men who created one of the most intense and memorable thrillers of the 1960s, and they hated each other so much that they could never celebrate what they had accomplished together. Cape Fear should have been something both men could look back on with pride, a professional high point where their different styles and approaches created something greater than the sum of its parts. Instead, it became a symbol of everything they disliked about each other, a reminder of professional and personal disappointment. And yet, the final irony is that their animosity probably made the film better. All that real tension between them, all that genuine dislike and resentment, came through on screen in a way that purely professional actors might not have been able to manufacture. When you watch Cape Fear, especially if you know the backstory, you can see it in their eyes, the way Peck Sam Bowden looks at Mitchum's. In the end, maybe that's the lesson here. Great art doesn't always come from happy collaborations and mutual admiration societies. Sometimes the most powerful creative work comes from friction, from conflict, from people who challenge each other precisely because they see the world in fundamentally different ways. Gregory Peck and Robert Mitchum represented opposing philosophies of acting, opposing approaches to fame and professionalism, opposing ideas about what it meant to be a movie star in mid-20th century America. They could never be friends. They could barely be colleagues. But for a few months in 1961 and 1962, they were forced to work together. And what emerged from that difficult collaboration was something neither of them could have created on their own. So the next time you watch Cape Fear, whether it's the original or the remake, think about what was really happening behind the scenes. Think about Gregory Peck, the dignified gentleman of Hollywood, grappling with his genuine dislike for his co-star while trying to maintain his professional standards and his public image. Think about Robert Mitchum, the rebel who refused to play by Hollywood's rules, pushing boundaries and pushing buttons, seemingly oblivious to or unconcerned with how his behavior affected those around him. Think about that real punch that connected, that moment when acting became reality, and control gave way to raw emotion. And think about how two men who hated each other managed to create something that audiences have loved for more than 60 years. This is the truth about Hollywood that the publicity machines never wanted you to know. Behind every great film, behind every perfect performance, behind every magical moment on screen, there are real people with real conflicts, real resentments, real hatred sometimes. Gregory Peck truly hated Robert Mitchum more than anyone. Not because Mitchum was a bad person or even a bad actor, but because Mitchum represented everything Peck had built his career in opposition to. And that hate, that fundamental incompatibility, that complete inability to understand or appreciate each other's approach to their shared profession, created a dynamic on screen that no amount of professional courtesy and mutual respect could have replicated. It's a reminder that the people we see on screen are never just the characters they play. They're complex human beings with egos and insecurities, with strong opinions and deep feelings, with a capacity for both great generosity and petty resentments. Gregory Peck was a great man in many ways. A humanitarian, a political activist, a champion of civil rights and social justice. But he was also human enough to hold a grudge, to let his anger or perceived disrespect fester for decades, to never forgive someone who had violated his sense of how professional relationships should work. And Robert Mitchum, for all his faults, was authentic in a way that few actors of that era managed to be. He never pretended to be something he wasn't, never constructed a false image, never apologized for approaching his work differently than the establishment expected. So when we talk about Gregory Peck truly hating someone more than anyone else, we're not just talking about a celebrity feud or a behind-the-scenes scandal. We're talking about a fundamental clash of values, a conflict between different ways of being an artist and being a person in the public eye. We're talking about what happens when generosity is met with what feels like ingratitude, when control encounters chaos, when tradition confronts rebellion. And we're talking about how all of that messy human reality can somehow be transformed into art that transcends the circumstances of its creation. That's the real story of Gregory Peck, and the actor he hated more than anyone. It's complicated, it's human, and it's a reminder that the golden age of Hollywood wasn't really so golden after all. It was just people doing their best, sometimes succeeding brilliantly, sometimes failing miserably, and sometimes creating magic precisely because of their failures and conflicts rather than in spite of them. And that, in its own way, is more fascinating and more valuable than any sanitized studio-approved version of events could ever be.